Tonight, we're traveling into the quiet spaces of history. Not the great battles that filled chronicles, not the kings whose names survived for centuries, but the mysteries left behind when records end, witnesses disappear, and certainty fades into silence. Across the world, there are stories that seem to dissolve the closer we examine them. Entire communities that vanished from history. Lost tombs sought for over 1,000 years. Forgotten archives that may have contained answers to questions we still ask today. Most historical mysteries are eventually solved. New discoveries emerge. Documents are uncovered. Archaeologists piece together fragments of evidence and slowly reveal what happened. But some mysteries remain stubbornly unsolved, not because nobody has looked for the answers, but because time itself appears to have hidden them. Tonight, we'll explore 10 such mysteries. These are not tales of curses or supernatural events. Instead, they are stories about the limits of human knowledge. Stories where the surviving evidence is incomplete. Stories where historians disagree. Stories where every answer seems to create new questions. So settle in, perhaps lower the lights, and as we journey through these forgotten corners of the past, remember that history is not simply a record of what happened. It is also a record of everything that was lost. And sometimes, what was lost becomes the greatest mystery of all. Our first story begins on a rugged island in the North Atlantic, a place of forests, rivers, rocky coastlines, and long winters. A place where an entire people slowly disappeared from history, or perhaps disappeared only from the written record. This is the mystery of the Beothuk survivors. The vanishing of the Beothuk survivors. Imagine standing on the wind-swept coast of Newfoundland sometime in the early 16th century. The Atlantic stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Dense forests cover the interior. Salmon fill the rivers. Caribou move through the landscape in great seasonal migrations. For thousands of years, indigenous communities had lived here, adapting to the island's harsh climate and rich natural resources. Among them were the people now known as the Beothuk. For centuries, they occupied parts of Newfoundland, developing a way of life closely connected to the rhythms of the island. European visitors would eventually describe them as distinctive for their use of red ochre. They often coated tools, clothing, possessions, and even their bodies with the red pigment. As a result, some outsiders referred to them as the Red Indians of Newfoundland, a term rooted in those observations. Today, however, historians use the name Beothuk. Yet despite centuries of research, one of the most important questions surrounding the Beothuk remains unanswered. What became of the final survivors? The traditional narrative appears straightforward. The Beothuk population declined during the 18th and 19th centuries. Disease spread. Access to resources became increasingly restricted. Conflict and displacement placed enormous pressure on communities already facing dramatic change. Eventually, according to historical records, the Beothuk disappeared. But history is rarely that simple. And the deeper researchers look into the surviving evidence, the more complicated the story becomes. To understand the mystery, we must first understand the world that was changing around them. When European fishermen, traders, and settlers began arriving in larger numbers, Newfoundland entered a period of transformation. The island's coastal regions became increasingly important for fishing. Settlements expanded. Trade networks shifted. Competition for resources intensified. For indigenous communities, these changes created challenges that could reshape entire ways of life. The Beothuk often avoided direct contact with newcomers. Many historical accounts suggest they gradually withdrew from areas where European activity became concentrated. Rather than integrating into expanding colonial settlements, they frequently moved inland. This strategy may have helped preserve independence in the short term, but it also created new difficulties. Many important food sources were located near rivers and coastal areas. As access became more restricted, survival grew increasingly difficult. Historians believe these pressures contributed significantly to population decline. Yet even here, certainty remains elusive. Much of what we know about the Beothuk comes from observations recorded by outsiders. Many accounts were incomplete, others reflected misunderstandings. Some were written by individuals who had only brief encounters with Beothuk communities. As a result, reconstructing their history requires careful interpretation. The surviving records provide valuable clues, but they do not always provide clear answers. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the mystery involves disease. Across the Americas, introduced diseases devastated indigenous populations. Smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, and other illnesses often spread far beyond the locations where Europeans first arrived. Communities lacking previous exposure faced extraordinary risks. Many historians believe disease played a major role in the decline of the Beothuk. This explanation is supported by broader patterns observed throughout North America. Yet surprisingly little direct evidence survives regarding exactly which diseases affected specific Beothuk communities and when. The historical record contains hints, but many details remain uncertain. As with so many ancient mysteries, researchers must piece together fragments. A mention in one document, an observation in another. A pattern that appears plausible but cannot be fully proven. The result is a story that remains partially hidden. Disease almost certainly mattered, but it may not tell the whole story. Another factor frequently discussed is isolation. Unlike some neighboring indigenous groups, the Beothuk appear to have maintained relatively limited participation in expanding trade networks. This distinction may have had profound consequences. Trade often provided access to tools, materials, and alliances that could help communities adapt to changing circumstances. Groups able to build new relationships sometimes gained advantages that improved long-term survival. The Beothuk followed a different path. Whether by choice, circumstance, geography, or a combination of factors, they often remain separate. That separation may have preserved cultural independence, yet it may also have increased vulnerability. Still, even this interpretation raises questions. Were they truly isolated? Or does the historical record simply fail to capture interactions that occurred beyond colonial observation? This question lies at the heart of the mystery. History tends to preserve what officials recorded, what traders documented, what governments considered important. But countless interactions left no written trace. Entire lives unfolded beyond the reach of official archives. And because of this, absence from records does not always mean absence from reality. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, reports involving the Beothuk became increasingly rare. Observers began describing smaller populations. Communities appeared more fragmented. Concern grew among some colonial officials who recognized that a unique culture might be disappearing. Several attempts were made to establish peaceful contact. Some efforts succeeded briefly. Others failed. Language barriers complicated communication. Mutual suspicion often existed. Years of misunderstanding could not be erased quickly. Among the most well-known individuals associated with this period was a woman named Shanodithit. She occupies a significant place in the historical record because she provided valuable information about Beothuk culture, traditions, and experiences. Her drawings and recollections remain important sources for researchers today. When Shanodithit died in 1829, many contemporary observers concluded that the Beothuk people had become extinct. For generations, this moment was often presented as the final chapter. The story appeared complete. A people had vanished. History had closed the book. Yet over time, researchers began questioning whether that conclusion was entirely accurate. The reason was simple. Human societies rarely disappear in neat, clearly documented ways. People move, families intermarry, communities merge, identities evolve, cultures adapt. The end of one historical label does not necessarily mean the disappearance of every descendant. This possibility has transformed the discussion surrounding the Beothuk. Today, many scholars approach the subject with greater caution. Instead of asking whether the Beothuk simply vanished, some researchers ask a different question. Could some survivors have joined neighboring indigenous communities? The idea is neither impossible nor unusual. Throughout history, populations facing hardship have often sought refuge with neighboring groups. In many regions, cultural boundaries were far more flexible than colonial records suggest. Individuals married across communities. Families relocated. New identities emerged. If this occurred among surviving Beothuk individuals, the historical implications would be significant. The people themselves may not have vanished entirely. Only the separate identity recognized by colonial observers may have faded from written records. evidence for this possibility remains limited. But intriguing clues exist. Oral traditions preserved by some indigenous communities have occasionally been interpreted as suggesting contact, integration, or shared ancestry. Researchers continue examining these accounts carefully. However, oral history and written documentation often operate differently. They preserve memory in distinct ways. Neither should be dismissed. Yet neither always provides definitive answers. The challenge lies in bringing different forms of evidence together. Archaeology adds another layer to the mystery. Excavations across Newfoundland have revealed valuable information about Beothuk life. Tools, settlement sites, artifacts, patterns of movement. Each discovery helps illuminate aspects of a culture that written records only partially describe. Yet archaeology also has limitations. Artifacts can reveal how people lived. They rarely reveal every detail about what happened to specific individuals. The final years remain difficult to reconstruct, and so the mystery persists, not because there are no clues, but because the clues point in multiple directions. Perhaps the traditional narrative is largely correct. Perhaps disease, displacement, and resource loss reduced the population until no separate Beothuk community remain. Or perhaps some survivors continue their lives elsewhere, carrying memories, traditions, and ancestry into neighboring societies. If so, the disappearance may have been less complete than older histories once assumed. What makes this mystery especially haunting is that it sits at the intersection of history and memory. We often imagine disappearance as a sudden event, a single moment, a final chapter. But in reality, disappearance can be gradual, a language spoken by fewer people each generation, a community scattered across new landscapes, a name that fades from official documents even as descendants continue living. The story of the Beothuk reminds us that history is not always about clear endings. Sometimes it is about uncertainty, about questions that remain open, about lives that leave traces but not complete explanations. On the rugged shores of Newfoundland, the wind still moves across the same coastline known to the Beothuk centuries ago. Rivers continue flowing toward the Atlantic. Forests still cover much of the interior. The landscape remains, but the full story of the people who once called it home remains incomplete. And perhaps that is why the mystery continues to resonate today. Because somewhere between documented history and forgotten memory lies a question that may never be fully answered. What truly became of the last Beothuk survivors? The lost tomb of Alaric I. In the summer of the year 410, something happened that shocked the ancient world. For nearly 8 centuries, Rome had stood as the heart of a vast empire. Its armies had marched across continents. Its laws shaped nations. Its emperors commanded immense power. Even as the Western Roman Empire weakened, the city itself remained a powerful symbol. To many people, Rome seemed eternal. Then, in August of 410, that illusion shattered. A Gothic army entered the city. For 3 days, Rome was sacked. Although the destruction was not as complete as later legends sometimes suggested, the psychological impact was enormous. News of the event spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Writers struggled to comprehend what had happened. For generations, people had believed Rome could never fall. Now, they knew otherwise. At the center of this extraordinary moment stood a man named Alaric, king of the Visigoths, military leader, negotiator, enemy of Rome, and in many ways a product of the Roman world itself. Today, more than 1,600 years later, Alaric remains famous for his role in one of history's most dramatic events. Yet one of the most fascinating mysteries surrounding him has nothing to do with the sack of Rome. Instead, it concerns what happened only months later. Because shortly after his greatest victory, Alaric died unexpectedly, and according to a remarkable story preserved through the centuries, he was buried in a place so secret that no one has ever found it. If the story is true, one of the most important royal tombs of late antiquity remains hidden somewhere beneath the landscape of southern Italy, waiting, unseen, lost to history. To understand the mystery, we must first understand the man. Alaric was born sometime around the middle of the 4th century. Precise details about his early life remain uncertain. Like many figures of the period, the surviving evidence is incomplete. What historians do know is that he emerged during a time of enormous change. The Roman Empire was facing growing pressures. Political instability weakened central authority. Economic difficulties affected many regions. Meanwhile, various Gothic groups interacted with the empire in increasingly complex ways. Some served as allies, others fought as enemies. Many occupied both roles at different times. Alaric himself spent much of his life operating within this complicated relationship. He was not simply an outsider attacking Rome. He had served within Roman military structures. He understood Roman politics. He negotiated repeatedly with imperial officials. In many respects, his story reflects the increasingly blurred boundaries between the empire and the peoples beyond its traditional frontiers. For years, Alaric sought recognition, territory, and security for his followers. Negotiations frequently broke down. Promises were made and abandoned. Political circumstances changed rapidly. As frustration grew, conflict intensified. Eventually, these tensions culminated in the march on Rome itself. When Alaric's forces entered the city in 410, the event immediately became one of the defining moments of the age. Ancient writers recorded reactions ranging from grief to disbelief. Some saw it as evidence of moral decline, others viewed it as a sign of divine judgment. Still others simply struggled to comprehend how such an event had become possible. Yet despite the drama of the sack, Alaric's triumph was surprisingly short-lived. Only a few months later, he was dead. Historical sources suggest he died in southern Italy, likely from illness. His death appears to have come suddenly. One moment he stood at the height of his power. The next, his followers were preparing his funeral. And it is here that the mystery truly begins. The most famous account of Alaric's burial comes from later historical traditions that describe an extraordinary effort to conceal his tomb. According to the story, his followers selected a river near the city of Cosenza in modern-day Italy. The river's waters were temporarily diverted. Once the riverbed was exposed, a burial chamber was prepared. Alaric was placed within it, along with treasures and valuable possessions. After the burial was completed, the river was allowed to flow back into its original course. The waters covered the site. The tomb disappeared beneath the river. But the story does not end there. According to the same tradition, the laborers who carried out the work were killed afterward. The purpose, supposedly, was to ensure that no one could reveal the location. No witnesses, no maps, no surviving knowledge. Only a hidden grave beneath flowing water. It is a dramatic story, perhaps too dramatic. And that immediately raises an important question. Did it really happen? The answer is surprisingly difficult to determine. The burial narrative comes from historical sources written after the events themselves. Like many accounts from late antiquity, it combines valuable information with elements that may have been shaped by storytelling traditions. Historians generally agree that Alaric died in southern Italy. That much appears reasonably secure. The uncertainty concerns the details of the burial. Was a river truly diverted? Was a secret tomb created? Were treasures buried alongside him? Or did later generations gradually embellish the story? These questions remain unresolved. What makes the mystery especially intriguing is that parts of the account are not entirely impossible. Ancient societies occasionally undertook impressive engineering projects. Rivers could be redirected. Large-scale construction was certainly within the capabilities of the period. The challenge is not whether such a burial was theoretically possible. The challenge is finding evidence that it actually occurred. And so far, definitive evidence has remained elusive. For centuries, treasure hunters, historians, and archaeologists have searched for clues. Many focused their attention on the area around Cosenza. The city occupies a strategic location where rivers and valleys intersect. The surrounding landscape contains countless places where traces of ancient activity might remain hidden. Over the years, numerous theories emerged. Some suggested specific river locations. Others proposed nearby hills or buried chambers. Occasionally, reports surfaced claiming that the tomb had finally been discovered. Each time, excitement briefly followed. And each time, the claims failed to provide conclusive proof. The mystery endured. Part of the difficulty lies in the landscape itself. Rivers are dynamic. They change course. Floods reshape terrain. Sediment accumulates over centuries. Even if the traditional story is substantially accurate, locating a burial site after 1600 years would be extraordinarily difficult. The environment may have altered dramatically since Alaric's death. Features visible in the 5th century may no longer exist in recognizable form. A river channel can migrate, banks can erode, entire sections of landscape can transform. This means that even modern technology faces significant challenges. Ground surveys can help. Remote sensing can reveal hidden structures. Archaeological methods continue improving, yet the search remains complicated by uncertainty regarding where investigators should focus their efforts. After all, no one knows whether the traditional burial location is correct. Another fascinating aspect of the mystery concerns the treasures supposedly buried with Alaric. According to popular retellings, vast riches accompanied him into the grave. Some stories even claim that treasures taken during the sack of Rome were included. This image has captured imaginations for generations. A hidden royal tomb, lost wealth, ancient secrets beneath a river. It sounds almost like the plot of an adventure novel, yet historians approach such claims cautiously. Ancient and medieval accounts often exaggerated royal wealth. Stories of buried treasure tend to grow larger over time. A valuable burial can gradually become a legendary one. A modest collection of grave goods can transform into unimaginable riches. Without archaeological evidence, separating fact from embellishment becomes difficult. Still, the possibility remains intriguing. Royal burials frequently contained objects of status and symbolic importance. If Alaric's tomb survives undiscovered, it could potentially offer extraordinary insights into the culture, politics, and material world of the Visigoths. That possibility helps explain why interest in the mystery remains strong. The tomb represents more than lost treasure. It represents lost knowledge, and sometimes, knowledge is the greatest treasure of all. As researchers continue investigating the late Roman world, Alaric occupies a unique position. He stands at the intersection of two eras. One world was fading, another was emerging. The political landscape of Europe was changing rapidly. Traditional Roman authority weakened while new kingdoms developed across former imperial territories. Alaric's life reflects these transformations. His burial, if it could be located, might reveal important details about how his followers understood leadership, identity, and power during this period of transition. That prospect has inspired generations of historians. Yet perhaps the mystery survives for a deeper reason. The story of the hidden tomb contains themes that resonate across cultures and centuries. A powerful ruler dies unexpectedly. A secret burial conceals his final resting place. Time erases the location. Future generations search for answers. The pattern appears again and again throughout history. Lost graves capture the imagination because they represent unfinished stories. The life may be documented. The achievements may be recorded, but the final chapter remains missing. Alaric's tomb belongs to this tradition. Somewhere in southern Italy, perhaps beneath layers of earth and stone, perhaps beneath an ancient river course, perhaps somewhere entirely different, the answer may still exist. Or perhaps the truth has already vanished. Records lost. Landscapes changed. Evidence destroyed by centuries of natural processes. This possibility cannot be ignored. History does not preserve everything. In fact, it preserves remarkably little. Most buildings disappear. Most documents vanish. Most lives leave only faint traces. The survival of any evidence at all is often extraordinary. And yet, despite these obstacles, the search continues. New archaeological techniques emerge. Researchers revisit old assumptions. Historical texts are re-examined. Maps are compared. Landscapes are studied. Each generation hopes it might be the one that finally solves the puzzle. Perhaps someday a buried chamber will be discovered. Perhaps an overlooked document will emerge from an archive. Perhaps technology not yet invented will reveal what remains hidden today. Or perhaps the mystery will endure indefinitely, a secret carried through 16 centuries, a king whose final resting place remains unknown. As evening settles over the valleys of southern Italy, rivers continue flowing through landscapes that Alaric himself once crossed. Water moves past ancient stones. Mountains watch silently from the horizon. Villages and cities occupy lands shaped by countless generations. Somewhere within that landscape lies a story that has never been fully told. A burial, a hidden grave, a vanished location, and a question that continues to echo across the centuries. Where was Alarigai, the king who sacked Rome, finally laid to rest? For now, history remains silent. The missing expedition of Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real. There are few mysteries more haunting than a ship that never returns. No battlefield remains, no ruined settlement, no tomb hidden beneath a mountain. Only silence. A vessel departs from a harbor filled with anticipation, sails beyond the horizon, and then disappears into the vastness of the sea. For centuries, oceans have swallowed countless voyages. Storms, ice, navigational errors, mechanical failures, and simple bad luck have erased ships from history with startling efficiency. Yet some disappearances leave behind more questions than answers. One such mystery unfolded at the dawn of the 16th century, during an age when European explorers were pushing farther into the Atlantic than ever before. It was a time of ambition, a time of discovery, a time when maps contained enormous blank spaces waiting to be filled, and it was during this period that two brothers sailed westward into uncertainty. Neither would ever return. Their names were Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real. More than 500 years later, historians still debate what happened to them. No verified wreck has been found. No confirmed account explains their fate. No surviving witness left a definitive answer. Instead, only fragments remain, scattered clues, conflicting theories, and one of the oldest maritime mysteries in North Atlantic history. To understand why their disappearance became so famous, we must first travel back to Portugal at the beginning of the Age of Exploration. The late 15th century was a remarkable period for European navigation. Portuguese sailors had spent decades exploring the coast of Africa. New sea routes were being established. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation made increasingly ambitious voyages possible. Across Europe, monarchs recognized that exploration could bring wealth, influence, and strategic advantages. Competition was intense. Every voyage carried the possibility of discovering new trade opportunities, valuable resources, or territories previously unknown to Europeans. The Atlantic Ocean, once viewed as a daunting barrier, increasingly became a highway of exploration. Among the many noble families involved in this expanding maritime world was the Corte-Real family. They were experienced seafarers with connections to exploration efforts supported by the Portuguese crown. Gaspar Corte-Real emerged as one of the most ambitious members of the family. Historical records suggest that he participated in voyages toward the North Atlantic around the turn of the 16th century. Like many explorers of the era, he was searching for opportunity. The exact goals of these expeditions remain somewhat unclear. Explorers often pursued multiple objectives simultaneously. They sought geographic knowledge, potential trade routes, fishing grounds, natural resources, and territories that might benefit their sponsors. What is certain is that Gaspar sailed into waters that Europeans were only beginning to understand. The North Atlantic could be both magnificent and unforgiving. Dense fog frequently obscured visibility. Powerful storms appeared with little warning. Icebergs drifted southward from Arctic regions. Navigational challenges multiplied as sailors ventured farther from familiar routes. Even under favorable conditions, these waters demanded respect. In 1500 and 1501, Gaspar Corte-Real undertook voyages westward that appear to have reached parts of northeastern North America. The surviving documentation is incomplete, but historians generally believe he explored regions associated with present-day Newfoundland and nearby coastal areas. These voyages contributed to Europe's growing knowledge of the Western Atlantic. Reports from returning ships generated considerable interest. The possibility of new opportunities captured attention both in Portugal and elsewhere. Then came the voyage that transformed exploration into mystery. In 1501, Gaspar Corte-Real departed on another expedition. Several ships sailed together. As was common practice, portions of the fleet eventually separated during exploration activities. At some point, some vessels successfully returned to Portugal. Gaspar's ship did not. Weeks passed, then months. No sign appeared. No confirmed report arrived. No survivors emerged. The explorer had vanished. For many families, such uncertainty would have marked the end of the story. The sea was dangerous. Losses were common. Yet the Corte-Real family was unwilling to accept complete uncertainty. The following year, Gaspar's brother Miguel organized a new expedition. His objective was straightforward: find Gaspar, bring him home if possible, discover what had happened. It was a mission shaped by hope. Perhaps the missing ship had become stranded. Perhaps severe weather had forced an unexpected landing. Perhaps survivors remained alive somewhere along an unfamiliar coastline. Miguel set sail, determined to uncover the truth. Instead, he vanished as well. Like his brother before him, he disappeared into the North Atlantic. And just as before, no definitive explanation followed. Now 2 brothers were gone. 2 expeditions had ended in silence. The mystery deepened dramatically. The loss of a single explorer might be explained as misfortune. The disappearance of both brothers created a puzzle that would endure for centuries. Contemporary observers struggled to understand what had happened. News traveled slowly during this era, but eventually reports of the losses spread. Questions multiplied. Had one disaster claimed both expeditions? Had they encountered different fates? Were environmental conditions responsible? Or had some entirely unexpected event occurred? Unfortunately, surviving evidence offered few answers. Unlike many later maritime disasters, there were no detailed investigative reports, no radio transmissions, no distress signals, no recovered logbooks, only scattered references preserved within official correspondence and historical records. As a result, historians have spent generations attempting to reconstruct events from limited information. One of the most widely accepted explanations involves the environment itself. The North Atlantic is among the most challenging maritime regions on Earth. Even modern vessels equipped with advanced technology respect its dangers. In the early 16th century, those dangers were significantly greater. Weather forecasting did not exist. Charts remained incomplete. Navigational instruments were useful but imperfect. Ships were sturdy for their time, but vulnerable to severe storms. A powerful storm could easily scatter vessels, damage rigging, or drive ships onto hidden shoals. If either expedition encountered extreme weather, survival would have become uncertain. This explanation possesses an important advantage: it requires no extraordinary assumptions. Many historical voyages ended this way. Nature alone may have been sufficient. Yet while plausible, the storm theory cannot be proven conclusively. No surviving record documents such an event directly, and so alternative possibilities remain part of the discussion. Another theory focuses on ice. The waters explored by the Corte-Real expeditions were influenced by currents carrying icebergs and sea ice southward. These hazards could be difficult to detect, particularly in fog. A collision might have caused catastrophic damage. Alternatively, ice conditions could have trapped ships or restricted movement. Even if a vessel survived initial encounters, prolonged isolation could create severe logistical challenges. Food supplies might diminish. Repairs could become impossible. Morale could deteriorate. Again, the theory is plausible. Again, definitive evidence remains absent. Some historians have explored the possibility that one or both expeditions reached land but failed to return. The North American coastline is vast. A damaged vessel might have forced explorers ashore. Stranded crews could have attempted survival under unfamiliar conditions. If contact with local indigenous communities occurred, outcomes might have varied considerably depending on circumstances. The challenge with this hypothesis is documentation. No verified record confirms such events, yet the absence of records does not necessarily eliminate the possibility. The historical archive from this period contains many gaps. Entire stories have vanished because nobody recorded them, or because records failed to survive. This uncertainty keeps the theory alive. There are also more speculative ideas. Over the centuries, some writers proposed dramatic explanations involving hidden settlements, secret colonies, or undiscovered encounters. Such theories often capture public imagination. They transform historical mysteries into legends. Yet most scholars approach these claims cautiously. Extraordinary explanations require extraordinary evidence, and so far, such evidence has not emerged. Still, the persistence of these theories reveals something interesting about human nature. When answers are missing, imagination often fills the void. Mysteries invite storytelling. The less we know, the more possibilities seem available. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. The Corte-Real mystery is no exception. Another fascinating aspect of the story concerns cartography. Maps created during the early 16th century sometimes reflected information gathered from exploratory voyages. Researchers have carefully examined surviving charts in hopes of finding clues. Could geographic details preserved on maps reveal where the explorers traveled? Could they indicate routes later forgotten? In some cases, maps appear to contain knowledge derived from voyages associated with the Corte-Real expeditions. These details help historians understand the broader context of exploration, yet they stop frustratingly short of solving the mystery itself. The maps suggest movement, not destiny, direction, not fate. The final outcome remains hidden. As centuries passed, the disappearance gradually entered historical memory. What began as a contemporary concern evolved into an enduring puzzle. Generations of historians revisited the evidence. Maritime scholars analyzed navigation patterns. Researchers compared surviving documents. New interpretations emerged. Old theories were challenged. Yet no consensus explanation gained universal acceptance. Part of the mystery's appeal lies in its timing. The brothers vanished during a period when the Atlantic world was being transformed. Exploration was expanding rapidly, knowledge was growing, but uncertainty remained enormous. Large portions of the world existed only as rumors on European maps. Voyages frequently entered regions that few people understood. Every expedition balanced opportunity against risk. The Corte-Real brothers operated at the edge of that uncertainty. Their disappearance reminds us how fragile exploration could be. History often celebrates successful voyages. The ships that returned. The discoveries that changed maps. The navigators who became famous. But for every celebrated expedition, there were others that vanished. Lost crews, missing ships, stories that ended before they could be recorded. The Corte-Real mystery belongs to that quieter side of exploration history, a reminder that discovery carried enormous costs. Even today, despite advances in archaeology and historical research, the ocean retains many secrets. Shipwrecks remain undiscovered. Historical puzzles persist. The Atlantic that challenged 16th century sailors still possesses immense power. Storms continue to reshape coastlines. Currents continue moving across vast distances. The sea preserves some stories while erasing others. Perhaps someday new evidence will emerge. An overlooked document hidden within an archive. A shipwreck identified through underwater exploration. A clue preserved in a collection not yet fully studied. History occasionally surprises us in this way. Questions that seem impossible to answer suddenly become solvable. Yet until such evidence appears, the fate of Gaspar and Miguel Corte-Real remains uncertain. Two brothers sailed westward during an age of exploration. One disappeared. The other followed in search of answers. Then he disappeared as well. The Atlantic closed behind them. The centuries passed, and the mystery remained. Somewhere beyond the edge of documented history lies the truth of what happened during those voyages. Whether it was storm, ice, isolation, miscalculation, or something else entirely, nobody can say with certainty. For now, the ocean keeps its secret. And the story of the Corte-Real brothers remains one of the most enduring, unsolved mysteries of the age of exploration. The disappearance of the Norumbega settlements. Some mysteries begin with a vanished city. Others begin with a forgotten kingdom. This one begins with a name. A single word that appeared on maps and travel accounts and in the imaginations of explorers for centuries. Norumbega. Today, the name is unfamiliar to most people. It does not appear on modern maps. No confirmed ruins have been identified. No archaeological discovery has definitively revealed its location. Yet for generations, European explorers, geographers, merchants, and scholars believed Norumbega was real. Some describe it as a wealthy settlement. Others portrayed it as an important trading center. Certain maps suggested it occupied a prominent place along the northeastern coast of North America. And yet, despite centuries of investigation, nobody has ever proven exactly what Norumbega was. Was it a genuine settlement that disappeared? A misunderstood indigenous community described inaccurately by outsiders? a geographic misunderstanding repeated across generations of maps, or simply a legend that grew larger each time it was retold? The answers remain uncertain, and that uncertainty has transformed Norumbega into one of the most fascinating cartographic mysteries in history. To understand the puzzle, we must travel back to an age when much of North America remained unknown to Europeans. The 16th century was a remarkable period of exploration. Ships crossed the Atlantic with increasing frequency. New coastlines were charted. Rivers were mapped. Reports flowed back to Europe from sailors eager to describe what they had seen. But information traveled slowly, communication was imperfect, and mistakes could spread surprisingly far. A misunderstanding recorded by one explorer might influence maps for decades. An exaggerated report could become accepted fact. A rumor repeated often enough could acquire the appearance of truth. This was the world in which Norumbega emerged. One of the earliest references often associated with the mystery comes from accounts describing lands along the northeastern coast of North America. These reports varied considerably. Some focused on rivers, others mentioned settlements. Some referred to prosperous regions where trade appeared active. Over time, fragments of information became attached to the name Norumbega. Exactly how this process occurred remains debated. Historians continue examining the surviving sources in hopes of understanding how the legend developed. What makes the mystery particularly challenging is that Norumbega did not remain a single, consistent idea. Instead, it evolved. Each generation seemed to imagine it differently. On some maps, it appeared as a region. On others, it became a city. Sometimes it was linked to a great river. Other times it seemed associated with broader territories. The details shifted continuously. Yet the name endured. This persistence is one of the most intriguing aspects of the mystery. Normally, inaccurate geographic information eventually disappears. Repeated exploration tends to correct mistakes. Maps improve. Descriptions become more precise. Errors are removed. But Norumbega survived for centuries. Why? The answer may lie in the nature of early exploration itself. When explorers returned from unfamiliar lands, they often relied on limited observations. Coastlines stretched for immense distances. Language barriers complicated communication. Local place names could be misunderstood. Descriptions passed through translators and intermediaries before reaching mapmakers. By the time information appeared on a European map, it might differ considerably from what was originally observed. A single misunderstanding could produce lasting consequences. Some researchers believe this process may explain the origins of Norumbega. Perhaps explorers encountered indigenous communities engaged in extensive trade. Perhaps they heard local names that were transformed through translation. Perhaps they misunderstood descriptions of geographic features. Over time, these fragments may have merged into something larger, a place that existed on paper more clearly than it existed in reality. Yet this explanation, while plausible, does not fully solve the mystery, because some descriptions of Norumbega are surprisingly detailed. One of the most influential figures associated with the story was the French explorer and navigator Samuel de Champlain. During his explorations of northeastern North America in the early 17th century, Champlain actively searched for locations connected to earlier reports. He was aware of stories surrounding Norumbega. He knew previous travelers had described it, and he hoped to find evidence confirming its existence. What he discovered instead deepened the mystery. Champlain explored regions where Norumbega was supposedly located. He examined rivers. He visited indigenous communities. He observed the landscape carefully. Yet he found nothing matching the grand descriptions that had circulated for decades. No wealthy city, no great urban center, no settlement corresponding to the expectations created by earlier reports. This absence raised an important question. Had Norumbega once existed and disappeared, or had it never existed in the form people imagined? Champlain's observations carried considerable weight. Unlike some earlier accounts, his work was based on direct investigation. Yet even his conclusions did not entirely erase belief in Norumbega. The name continued appearing on maps long afterward. The legend proved remarkably resilient. Part of the reason may involve the psychology of exploration. People are naturally drawn toward hidden places, lost cities, forgotten kingdoms, buried civilizations. Such stories inspire curiosity. They suggest that important discoveries remain waiting just beyond the edge of current knowledge. Throughout history, many explorers pursued locations described in earlier accounts. Some were real, others turned out to be misunderstandings. Norumbega occupied a fascinating position between these possibilities. It seemed plausible enough to believe, elusive enough to remain mysterious. Another important factor involves indigenous societies of northeastern North America. Long before European arrival, complex networks connected communities throughout the region. Trade routes extended across vast distances. Goods moved between groups. Knowledge traveled along established pathways. To outside observers unfamiliar with these systems, the scale of interaction could appear impressive. Some historians have suggested that reports of Norumbega may reflect European attempts to describe indigenous economic and social networks using concepts familiar to them. Rather than understanding decentralized relationships among multiple communities, explorers may have imagined a single, powerful settlement. In other words, Norumbega might represent a misunderstanding of something real, not a fabricated place, not a lost city, but an inaccurate interpretation of indigenous geography and trade. This possibility highlights an important challenge in historical research. People often describe unfamiliar cultures through the lens of their own assumptions. The result can produce distorted descriptions that are neither completely true nor completely false. Instead, they occupy a complicated middle ground, a place where reality and misunderstanding become intertwined. Cartography adds another fascinating layer to the mystery. Early maps were not merely navigational tools, they were also expressions of knowledge, speculation, and belief. Mapmakers frequently included information gathered from explorers, merchants, travelers, and previous maps. Not all sources were equally reliable. Sometimes uncertain information appeared alongside verified geography. As a result, maps became records not only of what people knew, but also of what they thought they knew. Norumbega illustrates this process beautifully. As decades passed, the settlement often appeared in different locations. Some maps placed it near major rivers. Others shifted it elsewhere. The name migrated across the landscape. Each appearance reinforced its apparent legitimacy. After all, if numerous maps included Norumbega, many people assumed it must exist. Yet, repetition does not necessarily create accuracy. An error copied repeatedly can acquire surprising authority. This phenomenon remains relevant even today. Information often gains credibility simply because it appears frequently. The history of Norumbega offers a reminder of how easily assumptions can become accepted truths. Still, the mystery remains compelling because certain questions persist. If Norumbega was entirely fictional, why did belief in it endure for so long? Why did experienced navigators continue discussing it? Why did respected mapmakers preserve it? Why did explorers search for it? These questions suggest that something meaningful lay behind the story. The challenge is identifying exactly what that something was. Archaeology has attempted to contribute answers. Researchers studying indigenous settlements throughout northeastern North America have uncovered evidence of extensive trade networks, sophisticated societies, and complex regional interactions. These discoveries demonstrate that the region was far more interconnected than many early European observers realized. However, none of these findings have revealed a settlement that definitively matches traditional descriptions of Norumbega. The archaeological record illuminates the broader historical context, but it does not solve the mystery outright. Instead, it reinforces the possibility that Norumbega may represent a distorted reflection of real communities rather than a single identifiable city. This interpretation has gained support among many modern historians. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. The surviving evidence simply does not allow complete certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty explains why the mystery continues to fascinate. Norumbega occupies a unique category of historical puzzle. Unlike a lost shipwreck or a missing tomb, the mystery is not merely about location. It is about perception, about how knowledge forms, about how stories evolve, about how maps can preserve both truth and misunderstanding simultaneously. The search for Norumbega is ultimately a search for understanding. Not only understanding a place, but understanding how people interpreted unfamiliar worlds. As European explorers pushed into new territories, they encountered landscapes that challenged existing assumptions. Information arrived incomplete, descriptions conflicted, interpretations varied. In this environment, legends could emerge naturally, not through deliberate deception, but through the gradual accumulation of uncertainty. Over centuries, Norumbega became more than a geographic question. It became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder of the vast gaps that once existed in human knowledge. Even now, historians continue studying the documents, maps, and accounts associated with the mystery. New interpretations occasionally emerge. Old assumptions are reconsidered. Yet the core question remains unanswered. Was Norumbega a real settlement that disappeared from history? Was it a misunderstood description of indigenous communities and trade networks? Was it an error repeated until it acquired a life of its own? Or was it something in between? Perhaps the answer contains elements of all these possibilities. History is rarely as simple as we imagine. Reality often resists clear categories. Truth can be layered, complex, and difficult to reconstruct centuries later. As night falls across the rivers and forests of northeastern North America, the landscapes once associated with Norumbega remain remarkably beautiful. Waterways continue winding toward the sea, forests stretch across the horizon, communities thrive where generations have lived before. The world that inspired the legend still exists, yet the mystery itself remains unresolved, a name preserved on fading maps, a place sought by explorers, a settlement that may never have existed exactly as described, and a reminder that some of history's most enduring mysteries are not hidden beneath the earth or lost beneath the sea. Sometimes they are hidden within the stories people tell, stories repeated so often that they become part of history itself. And somewhere between fact, memory, misunderstanding, and imagination, Norumbega continues to wait. A vanished settlement, a forgotten place, a mystery that refuses to disappear. The mystery of the first Greenland bishopric archives. Some historical mysteries begin with a missing person. Others begin with a lost city, a vanished expedition, or a forgotten kingdom. This mystery begins with missing documents. At first glance, that may not sound particularly dramatic. After all, archives disappear all the time. Libraries burn, records deteriorate, wars destroy collections. Floods, fires, neglect, and simple accidents have erased countless historical documents throughout the centuries. Yet occasionally, the loss of a collection creates a mystery far larger than the documents themselves, because sometimes those records contained answers to questions we are still asking today. And nowhere is this more evident than in the story of medieval Greenland. For hundreds of years, Norse communities lived on one of the most remote inhabited frontiers of the medieval world. They built farms, established churches, maintained trade connections, raised families, and created a society that endured for centuries in an environment few people would willingly choose. Then, gradually, they disappeared. The settlements faded from history. The farms were abandoned. The churches fell silent, and many of the records that might have explained what happened vanish as well. Among the most intriguing losses are the archives associated with Greenland's medieval bishopric. If these records once existed in the form many historians suspect, they may have contained invaluable information about daily life, political developments, religious affairs, trade connections, population changes, and perhaps even the final years of Norse Greenland itself. Instead, only fragments survive. The rest appears to have disappeared into history. And with them may have vanished one of the best opportunities to understand one of the medieval world's greatest mysteries. To appreciate the significance of these missing archives, we must first travel to Greenland itself. When most people think of Greenland today, they imagine vast ice sheets, towering glaciers, and remote Arctic landscapes. Much of that image is accurate. Greenland remains one of the most extraordinary environments on Earth. Yet when Norse settlers first arrived in the late 10th century, they encountered coastal regions that supported farming, livestock, and permanent settlement. Conditions were challenging, but they were not impossible. Led by figures such as the famous explorer Eric the Red, Norse settlers established communities along Greenland's southwestern coast. Over time, these settlements grew. Farms spread across fjords. Churches were constructed. Trade routes connected Greenland with Iceland, Norway, and the wider medieval world. For centuries, these communities survived despite enormous geographical isolation. The existence of medieval Greenland remains remarkable even today. Imagine living in a society separated from Europe by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. A place where communication could depend on seasonal voyages. A place where severe weather might delay contact for months or even years. Yet despite these obstacles, Greenland remained connected to Christian Europe. And one of the clearest symbols of that connection was the establishment of a bishopric. By the 12th century, Greenland possessed its own ecclesiastical administration. A bishop oversaw religious affairs. Churches operated throughout the settlements. Religious life became an important part of society. Like bishoprics elsewhere in medieval Europe, Greenland's church institutions likely generated records, documents concerning property, correspondence, appointments, financial matters, religious administration, legal questions, perhaps even descriptions of local events. This is where the mystery begins. Because if such archives once existed, almost none survive today. The absence is striking. Medieval institutions typically produced paperwork. Even in an age before printing, written records played a crucial role in governance and administration. Church organizations were particularly dependent upon documentation. Property ownership required records. Communication required records. Appointments required records. Disputes required records. Documents formed the backbone of institutional continuity. Yet when historians examine the surviving evidence for medieval Greenland, they encounter a frustrating silence. A few references survive in external sources. Scattered mentions appear in Icelandic texts, Norwegian documents, papal correspondence, and other records preserved elsewhere, but the local archival record itself is remarkably sparse. The result is a historical landscape filled with gaps. We know Greenland existed. We know churches operated there. We know bishops served there. But many details remain hidden, and because those details are missing, larger mysteries become harder to solve. One of the most important concerns the eventual disappearance of the Norse settlements themselves. For centuries, Greenland's Norse communities survived in a difficult environment. Then, sometime during the 15th century, they vanished. Exactly why remains a subject of ongoing research. Climate change likely played a role. Economic challenges may have contributed. Changing trade networks created new difficulties. Environmental pressures affected agriculture. Interactions with indigenous Inuit populations added another layer of complexity. Most historians believe multiple factors were involved. Yet despite decades of study, no single explanation fully accounts for every aspect of the disappearance. This is where the missing archives become so tantalizing. Imagine if detailed records from Greenland's bishopric had survived. Researchers might possess annual reports, correspondence discussing local conditions, descriptions of harvest failures, accounts of social tensions, evidence of migration, references to trade disruptions, or perhaps entirely unexpected information. Such documents could dramatically transform our understanding of medieval Greenland. Instead, historians must reconstruct events using limited sources, a handful of records, archaeological evidence, environmental data, and educated interpretation. The missing archives linger in the background like a shadow, always present, always reminding researchers of what might have been known. The mystery becomes even more intriguing when we consider how records disappear. Not every archive vanishes in the same way. Sometimes destruction is sudden. A fire consumes a building. A war devastates a city. A flood destroys collections. The loss occurs quickly and visibly, but other losses happen gradually. Documents deteriorate. Storage conditions worsen. Pages become damaged. Collections are dispersed. Individual records disappear over generations. By the time anyone notices, the archive is already gone. Which process affected Greenland? The answer remains uncertain. Several possibilities exist. One theory suggests that many records never survived the decline of the settlements themselves. As communities shrank, institutions weakened, buildings deteriorated, documents became vulnerable. If churches were abandoned, archives may simply have been left behind. Over time, harsh environmental conditions could have destroyed them completely. Another possibility involves transportation. Important documents were often moved throughout the medieval world. Records might be copied, transferred, or stored elsewhere. Some Greenland materials may have traveled to Iceland, Norway, or other locations. If so, portions could have been lost during later historical events far from Greenland itself. The medieval North Atlantic world was connected by maritime networks. Documents did not always remain where they originated. This possibility creates another fascinating question. Could some Greenland records still exist somewhere, unidentified within larger collections? Historians occasionally make extraordinary discoveries in archives. Forgotten manuscripts reappear, misclassified documents are recognized, lost texts emerge from unexpected places. Such discoveries are rare, but they happen. Every few years, researchers uncover materials that reshape historical understanding. The possibility that unidentified Greenland documents might survive somewhere cannot be completely dismissed. It remains unlikely, yet history has surprised scholars before. Another challenge involves what historians call archival dependency. This concept refers to situations where knowledge about one collection comes primarily through references preserved elsewhere. In Greenland's case, many scholars infer the existence of lost records because medieval institutions typically required documentation. References in surviving sources occasionally hint at administrative activity. The bishopric clearly functioned, therefore records likely existed, yet because those records are missing, historians must reconstruct them indirectly. It is rather like trying to understand a library after every book has disappeared. You know the library once existed. You can identify traces of its activity, but the contents themselves remain inaccessible. This situation creates both opportunity and frustration. Researchers can develop plausible interpretations, yet certainty remains elusive. Archaeology provides another important perspective. Over the last century, excavations in Greenland have revealed remarkable evidence about Norse life. Farmhouses, church ruins, tools, clothing, animal remains, household objects. These discoveries have transformed understanding of the settlements. They reveal resilience, adaptation, and complexity. The Norse communities were neither isolated relics nor helpless victims of circumstance. They were active participants in a changing world. Yet archaeology has limits. Material evidence can reveal how people lived. It cannot always reveal what they thought, what they worried about, what they planned, what they discussed in letters. Documents offer a uniquely human perspective. They preserve voices, decisions, concerns, arguments. And it is precisely those voices that seem largely absent from Greenland's archival record. Perhaps that is why the mystery feels so compelling. The missing archives represent more than lost paper. They represent lost conversations, lost observations, lost explanations. Imagine reading a letter written by a Greenland bishop describing unusual weather conditions, or a report discussing declining trade, or correspondence mentioning migration from remote farms. Such documents would not merely answer historical questions, they would bring individuals from the past into clearer focus. Instead, those voices remain faint, heard only indirectly through scattered references. The broader story of Greenland itself amplifies the mystery. For generations, the disappearance of the Norse settlements has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and the public alike. Why did a society survive for centuries and then vanish? How did people adapt to environmental change? What role did economics play? How important were cultural decisions? The missing archives hover over all these debates. Perhaps they contained answers. Perhaps they would have resolved long-standing questions, or perhaps they would have revealed that medieval Greenland was even more complex than researchers currently imagine. We cannot know. And that uncertainty is what transforms archival loss into historical mystery. As modern historians continue studying Greenland, new techniques provide valuable insights. Climate data extracted from ice cores, archaeological surveys, advanced dating methods, environmental reconstructions. Each contributes new information. Yet despite these advances, certain questions remain stubbornly difficult to answer. Because some forms of knowledge disappeared alongside the records themselves, As evening settles across Greenland's fjords, the landscapes that once supported Norse farms remain strikingly beautiful. Mountains rise above the water. Glaciers move slowly toward the sea. Ancient ruins stand as quiet reminders of lives once lived there. The churches may be gone. The communities may have vanished. The archives may have disappeared. Yet the questions remain. What was recorded in those lost documents? What stories did they contain? What insights vanished when the archives were lost? And most importantly, would those missing pages have helped explain one of the medieval world's greatest unsolved mysteries? For now, no one knows. The archives remain absent, the silence remains, and somewhere within that silence lies a chapter of history that may never be fully recovered. The strange death of Edmund Ironside. History often remembers great kings for the battles they fought, the kingdoms they conquered, the laws they created, or the dynasties they founded. Yet sometimes a ruler becomes famous for a mystery surrounding their final days, a death that arrived unexpectedly, a succession that unfolded too conveniently, a story intercrossed in fragments, shaped by politics and altered by generations of retelling. Such mysteries occupy a fascinating place in history, not because they can always be solved, but because they reveal how difficult it can be to separate fact from rumor once power is involved. The mystery of Edmund Ironside belongs to this category. More than 1,000 years ago, Edmund briefly ruled England during one of the most turbulent periods in its history. He fought determined campaigns against invading forces. He earned a reputation for courage and resilience, and for a short time he appeared capable of preserving Anglo-Saxon independence in the face of enormous challenges. Then, suddenly, he died. His reign lasted only a matter of months. The circumstances surrounding his death remain uncertain, and over the centuries those uncertainties gave rise to one of medieval England's most enduring historical puzzles. Was Edmund simply the victim of illness? Did the physical demands of war contribute to his decline? Or did political interests shape the story in ways that continue to obscure what truly happened? The surviving evidence provides clues, but not certainty, and it is within that uncertainty that the mystery endures. To understand the story, we must first travel back to early 11th century England. This was a period marked by instability, warfare, and competition for power. For decades, England had faced repeated attacks from Scandinavian raiders. Some came seeking wealth. Others sought territory. Still others pursued political influence. Over time, the scale of these incursions increased dramatically. Entire armies crossed the sea. Regions changed hands. Kings struggled to maintain control. The political landscape became increasingly fragile. Into this world was born Edmund, the son of King Ethelred II. Modern historians often remember Ethelred through his unfortunate nickname, the Unready, though the term originally carried a more nuanced meaning than many people realize. Regardless, his reign faced enormous challenges. Repeated invasions strained resources. Internal divisions weakened unity. Confidence in royal authority fluctuated. By the time Edmund reached adulthood, England stood at a crossroads. The kingdom faced perhaps its greatest external threat in generations. That threat came in the form of Knut, the Danish prince who had later become one of the most powerful rulers in northern Europe. Knut commanded substantial military forces. He possessed resources, ambition, and strategic skill. When his campaigns intensified, England became the center of a struggle that would determine the future of the kingdom. Amid this crisis, Edmund emerged as a significant leader. Historical accounts portray him as energetic and determined. Unlike some members of the political elite, he actively organized resistance. He gathered supporters, led armies, and repeatedly challenged Danish advances. His efforts earned admiration even among later chroniclers. The nickname Ironside reflected perceptions of strength, endurance, and military resolve. For a brief period, it seemed possible that Edmund might reverse England's fortunes. The year 1216 pivotal. A series of battles unfolded across the kingdom. Control shifted repeatedly. Victories and defeats followed one another in rapid succession. Both Edmund and Knut fought aggressively to secure dominance. The conflict culminated in the famous Battle of Assandun, Although historians continue debating certain details, the battle ultimately favored Connaught, yet the result did not immediately end the struggle. Instead, negotiations followed. An agreement emerged. According to surviving accounts, England would effectively be divided between the two rulers. Connaught would govern part of the kingdom. Edmund would retain authority over another portion. Given the circumstances, the arrangement may have represented a practical compromise. After years of warfare, stability offered advantages to both sides. Had events continued along this path, English history might have unfolded very differently, but they did not. Only a short time after reaching the agreement, Edmund died. The timing was extraordinary. One moment, England possessed two rulers sharing authority. The next, one of them was gone. As a result, Canute became king of all England. The transition occurred with remarkable speed, and almost immediately, questions began to emerge. What had happened to Edmund Ironside? The most straightforward explanation is illness. Medieval life was harsh, disease was common, medical knowledge remained limited. Even powerful rulers were vulnerable to infections, chronic conditions, and sudden health crises. Modern historians frequently emphasize this reality. From a purely statistical perspective, natural causes are entirely plausible. After all, many medieval rulers died unexpectedly. Not every royal death requires a conspiracy, yet the simplicity of this explanation has never completely satisfied everyone, partly because of the timing, partly because of later stories, and partly because the surviving evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Contemporary records provide relatively little detail about Edmund's final illness. Chroniclers often focused on political events rather than medical descriptions. When they did discuss deaths, explanations could be brief, sometimes astonishingly brief. As a result, historians possess only limited information regarding Edmund's final days. Into this gap, speculation gradually entered. One of the most famous legends emerged centuries later. According to certain accounts, Edmund was assassinated in an extraordinarily dramatic manner while using a privy. The details vary depending on the source. Some versions involve hidden attackers. Others describe elaborate plots. Still others add increasingly sensational elements. The story became one of the most repeated tales associated with Edmund's death. Yet modern historians generally approach it with considerable skepticism. The problem is chronology. The most dramatic versions appear long after the events themselves. As stories pass through generations, they often evolve. Details are added. Narratives become more colorful. Political agendas influence interpretation. What begins as rumor can eventually resemble accepted history. This process was common throughout the medieval world. The further a source stands from an event, the more cautiously historians tend to evaluate it. In Edmund's case, the sensational assassination stories face significant evidentiary challenges. There is little contemporary support for them. That does not necessarily prove they are false, but it does make certainty impossible. The question then becomes more complicated. If the dramatic assassination accounts are unreliable, does that mean Edmund certainly died of natural causes? Not necessarily. History rarely operates in such simple categories. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Political transitions have often generated suspicion, especially when one ruler benefits immediately from another's death. This does not imply wrongdoing. It merely explains why questions persist. Could it gained enormously from Edmund's passing? The power-sharing arrangement vanished. The kingdom became unified under a single ruler. From a political perspective, the outcome proved highly advantageous. Naturally, some observers wondered whether coincidence alone explained the timing. Yet here we encounter another challenge. Suspicion is not proof. Throughout history, many deaths have appeared convenient without being criminal. Powerful individuals often occupy positions where their deaths inevitably benefit someone else. The existence of motive does not establish guilt. This distinction is crucial. Responsible historical analysis requires evidence, and unfortunately, evidence remains scarce. Another fascinating aspect of the mystery involves medieval chroniclers themselves. Writers of the period were not neutral observers in the modern sense. They often possessed loyalties, political preferences, religious commitments, and institutional interests. Their accounts reflected those perspectives. Some sought to praise rulers, others sought to criticize them. Still others aimed to provide moral lessons. As a result, Historical narratives frequently blended factual reporting with interpretation. This reality complicates efforts to reconstruct Edmund's final days. Every source must be evaluated carefully. What was the author's purpose? When was the text written? What information was available? What biases might have influenced the account? These questions matter enormously. Because in many cases, the mystery is not simply what happened. The mystery is why people described events the way they did. The political context surrounding Edmund's death further deepens the puzzle. England was undergoing a major transformation. The transition from Anglo-Saxon rule to Canut's regime represented a significant shift in power. New alliances formed. Administrative structures adapted. Elite families repositioned themselves within the emerging political order. Such transitions often influence historical memory. Certain stories become emphasized, others fade. Records are preserved selectively. Interpretations evolve. Over time, the original event becomes increasingly difficult to isolate from the narratives built around it. This process does not require deliberate manipulation. Human memory naturally reshapes the past. Communities seek meaning, patterns, explanations. As a result, complex events often become simplified. Heroes and villains emerge, ambiguities disappear. Yet reality tends to remain more complicated. The death of Edmund Ironside exemplifies this challenge. Archaeology offers limited assistance here. Unlike mysteries involving lost settlements or hidden tombs, the primary evidence consists of texts. The physical traces associated with Edmund's life reveal little about his final illness or possible cause of death. Researchers must therefore rely heavily on documentary analysis. They compare sources, examine language, evaluate chronology, and attempt to distinguish contemporary information from later embellishment. The result is a careful balancing act. Most historians acknowledge that natural causes remain entirely plausible. At the same time, they recognize that uncertainties persist. The evidence simply does not allow absolute confidence. Perhaps that is why the mystery continues to fascinate, not because the answer is necessarily dramatic, but because the answer remains elusive. The death occurred at a critical moment. The consequences were enormous. The documentation is incomplete, and the stories surrounding the event evolved over centuries. Together, these factors create the perfect conditions for historical uncertainty. As evening settles across the English countryside, many of the landscapes associated with Edmund's campaigns remain recognizable. Rivers continue flowing through ancient valleys. Fields stretch across regions once contested by rival armies. Villages occupy ground where medieval travelers once passed. The world has changed dramatically since 1746, yet the questions remain. A king fought for his kingdom. A compromise briefly promised peace. Then, unexpectedly, he died. Was it illness? Exhaustion after years of conflict? A medical condition hidden from the historical record? Or is there some truth buried within the rumors that followed? More than 1,000 years later, historians continue searching for answers. But the evidence remains incomplete, and so the strange death of Edmund Ironside occupies that familiar place where history meets mystery, a place where certainty fades, where records fall silent, and where one of medieval England's most important turning points remains partially hidden behind the passage of time: the vanished monks of Lough Key. Some mysteries involve kings. Others involve lost treasure, forgotten cities, or missing expeditions. This mystery concerns a much smaller group of people, a handful of monks living on a quiet island surrounded by water. No great battles are associated with them. No famous ruler sought their counsel. No enormous fortune disappeared alongside them. And yet their story raises a question that historians still cannot answer with confidence. What happened to the monks who once lived among the islands of Lough Key? The mystery is not dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no sudden catastrophe recorded in surviving chronicles. No single event that clearly explains their disappearance. Instead, the puzzle emerges from absence. A community appears in the historical record. It exists for generations. Then gradually, the trail grows faint. Documents become scarce. References diminish. Eventually, certainty gives way to speculation. And somewhere within that silence lies the mystery. To understand it, we must first travel to Western Ireland. There, in County Roscommon, lies Lough Key. Today it is known for its scenic beauty. Woodlands surround its shores, small islands rise from the water. Ruins from different periods dot the landscape. Visitors often describe the area as peaceful, almost timeless. On calm days, reflections ripple across the lake's surface. Mist occasionally drifts over the water in the early morning hours. It is not difficult to imagine why people were drawn here centuries ago. For medieval monks, such locations possessed particular appeal. Throughout Ireland, monastic communities often sought places that balanced isolation with accessibility. An island offered protection from distractions. Water created a natural boundary between religious life and the wider world. At the same time, nearby settlements could still provide support when necessary. Lough Key contained many such islands, and among them were places where religious communities established themselves during the medieval period. The exact origins of some of these communities remain uncertain. This is common in early medieval Ireland. Records survive unevenly. Some monasteries left extensive documentation. Others appear only briefly in historical sources. Many communities existed long before detailed record-keeping became common. As a result, historians often reconstruct their histories through a combination of archaeology, annals, local traditions, and scattered references preserved in later documents. The monks associated with Lough Key belong largely to this category. We know they existed. We know religious life flourished in parts of the region. Yet many details remain frustratingly incomplete. This uncertainty forms the foundation of the mystery. Medieval Ireland possessed a rich monastic tradition. From the early centuries of Christianity onward, monasteries played important roles in education, scholarship, administration, and spiritual life. Some became major centers of learning. Others remained small and remote. Monks copied manuscripts, maintained churches, provided religious services, and participated in networks that connected communities across the island. Even isolated monasteries rarely existed entirely alone. Ideas, people, and information continued moving between them. The communities around Lough Key were part of this broader world. Yet, unlike some famous Irish monasteries whose histories are relatively well documented, the story here becomes increasingly difficult to trace as centuries pass. The challenge is not that references disappear completely. Rather, they become sporadic. A mention appears in one source, then decades pass with little information. Another reference emerges, then silence again. Historians attempting to reconstruct the history of these communities often encounter gaps that are difficult to fill. What happened during those missing years? Were the monasteries thriving, declining, relocating, changing in ways that simply went unrecorded? The surviving evidence rarely provides definitive answers. One possibility is that the mystery reflects a common historical reality. Many medieval religious communities gradually changed rather than disappearing suddenly. Economic circumstances evolved, population patterns shifted, political structures transformed, religious reforms altered institutional organization. A monastery that existed in one form during the 12th century might look very different by the 14th. Over time, continuity could become difficult to recognize. Names changed, administrative arrangements shifted, buildings were rebuilt or abandoned. To later observers, it might appear as though a community had vanished, when in reality it had simply transformed. This explanation appeals to many historians because it aligns with broader patterns observed elsewhere, yet it does not fully resolve the mystery, because questions remain regarding specific sites associated with Lough Key and the apparent disappearance of communities once linked to them. Another factor involves the nature of medieval records themselves. The historical archive is not a complete reflection of the past. It is a survival of fragments. Countless documents have been lost, libraries burned, manuscripts deteriorated, political upheavals destroyed collections. What survives often owes as much to chance as to importance. As a result, historians sometimes know surprisingly little about communities that may have existed for centuries. The absence of evidence can create the illusion of disappearance. A monastery might seem to vanish simply because its records no longer survive. This possibility must always be considered. Yet the mystery becomes more intriguing when local traditions enter the picture. Across Ireland, oral memory has preserved stories associated with lakes, islands, ruins, and religious sites for generations. Some traditions contain historical elements, others blend fact with folklore. Many exist somewhere between the two. Lough Key is no exception. Over time, stories accumulated around the islands and their former inhabitants. Some spoke of monks who left. Others suggested communities that faded quietly into history. Still others emphasized the passage of time itself, portraying the islands as places where memory lingered long after people disappeared. Such traditions cannot always be treated as literal history, yet they possess value. They reveal how communities remembered the landscape, how people interpreted visible ruins, how historical absence was explained through storytelling. In this way, folklore becomes part of the mystery rather than merely a response to it. Archaeology offers another perspective. Excavations and surveys conducted in and around Lough Key have revealed evidence of long-term human activity. Structures, foundations, artifacts, and landscape features demonstrate that the island supported communities across different periods. These discoveries confirm that religious life once existed there. Yet archaeology also encounters limitations. Material remains can reveal occupation. They can suggest chronology. They can illuminate aspects of daily life, but they do not always explain why communities declined or disappeared. A ruined building tells us that people once lived there. It rarely tells us why they left. Environmental factors may also have played a role. Lakes are dynamic environments. Water levels fluctuate. Storms alter shorelines. Vegetation changes. Access routes shift over time. Even modest environmental transformations can affect isolated settlements. A community dependent upon particular conditions may face increasing challenges if those conditions change. Researchers studying medieval landscapes often emphasize how sensitive small communities could be to gradual environmental pressures. Yet once again, certainty remains elusive. Evidence suggests possibilities rather than definitive conclusions. Political developments offer another avenue of explanation. Ireland's medieval history was shaped by changing kingdoms, regional rivalries, external influences, and evolving systems of governance. Religious institutions often found themselves affected by broader events. Patronage could increase or disappear. Protection might strengthen or weaken. Economic resources fluctuated. A small monastic community could survive for generations under favorable conditions, yet struggle when circumstances changed. If such processes affected the monks of Lough Key, the transition may have been gradual rather than dramatic. A decline unfolding over decades might leave only faint traces in surviving records. This gradual disappearance is one reason the mystery feels so haunting. Human beings often expect endings to be obvious. We imagine decisive moments, final battles, sudden catastrophes, clear conclusions. But history frequently operates differently. Communities fade, traditions weaken, institutions slowly dissolve. The process can be so gradual that participants themselves scarcely notice it. Only later, looking back across centuries, does the disappearance become visible. The monks of Lough Key may belong to this category, not victims of a single dramatic event, but participants in a long process of historical change. Yet even this interpretation leaves unanswered questions. Who were the final members of the community? Did they relocate elsewhere? Did they merge with larger institutions? Did religious life continue in forms no longer recognizable through surviving records? Or did the island simply become quieter until no community remained? The evidence does not allow complete certainty, and so the mystery persists. Perhaps that persistence reflects something larger than the fate of a single monastery. The story reminds us how fragile historical memory can be. Entire communities can exist, contribute, worship, work, and shape local landscapes, only to become faint shadows in the historical record. Not because they lacked importance, but because time erodes evidence unevenly. Some lives are documented extensively, others survive only through scattered traces. The monks of Lough Key occupy that uncertain territory, visible enough to know they existed, obscure enough that many details remain unknown. As modern visitors walk through the region, they encounter landscapes layered with history. Ancient ruins stand among trees. Stone walls emerge from the earth. The lake reflects the sky much as it did centuries ago. Birds move across the water. Wind passes through the islands. The setting remains remarkably peaceful. It is easy to imagine monks once crossing these waters in small boats. Easy to picture daily routines unfolding within isolated religious communities, morning prayers, simple meals, manuscript work, conversations, moments of quiet reflection. Yet the people themselves are gone. Only fragments remain, a reference in a document, a ruined structure, a local tradition, a question without a complete answer. What happened to the monks who once lived among the islands of Lough Key? Did they leave willingly? Did changing circumstances gradually dissolve their community? Were their stories lost alongside vanished records, or is the mystery itself simply a reflection of how history fades when memory grows thin? Perhaps we will never know, and perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what makes the story so compelling, because in the end, the mystery of the vanished monks is not only about disappearance, it is about remembrance, about the countless lives that shaped the past but left only faint traces behind, and about the quiet places where history lingers, even after the people themselves have faded into silence. The lost crown jewels of King John. Few objects capture the imagination quite like lost treasure. A missing crown, a chest of gold, jewels that vanished centuries ago and were never recovered. Such stories seem almost designed to endure. They combine history, mystery, and the possibility that somewhere, hidden beneath earth or water, a remarkable discovery still waits to be made. Yet many treasure legends become exaggerated over time. Values grow larger. Details become more dramatic. Rumors gradually replace evidence. The challenge for historians is determining where history ends and legend begins. Few stories illustrate this better than the mystery of the lost crown jewels of King John. For more than 800 years, people have wondered what happened to a collection of royal treasures that supposedly disappeared during one of the most turbulent periods in English history. The event itself is documented. The circumstances are reasonably well known, and yet the final fate of the treasure remains uncertain. No confirmed recovery has ever occurred. No definitive explanation has emerged. Instead, historians are left with scattered records, competing theories, and one of medieval England's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The story begins with a king who has rarely enjoyed a favorable reputation. King John ruled England from 1199 until 1216. He was the youngest son of King Henry II and the brother of the famous Richard the Lionheart. Yet unlike Richard, whose image became associated with crusades and military heroism, John's legacy developed quite differently. Medieval chroniclers often portrayed him critically. Later writers frequently amplified those criticisms. As a result, John became one of the most controversial monarchs in English history. To be fair, his reign was extraordinarily difficult. Political tensions increased throughout the kingdom. Conflicts with powerful nobles intensified. Military setbacks weakened royal authority. Financial pressures created widespread resentment. By the final years of his rule, England was experiencing profound instability. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty that the mystery of the crown jewels emerged. To understand the event, we must travel to the autumn of 1216. At this point, King John faced a major rebellion among sections of the English nobility. Civil conflict disrupted the kingdom. Foreign involvement complicated matters further. John spent much of his final year moving rapidly across different regions, attempting to maintain control and secure support. Travel in medieval England was often difficult even under favorable circumstances. Roads varied considerably in quality. Weather conditions could create serious obstacles. Rivers, marshes, and tidal areas presented additional challenges. Moving people was complicated. Moving large quantities of valuable property was even more difficult. Yet medieval rulers frequently traveled with extensive baggage trains. Royal households required equipment, supplies, documents, ceremonial objects, and personal possessions. Treasures often accompanied the king as he moved from place to place. Among these valuables were items associated with royal authority itself: crowns, jewels, regalia, objects that symbolized kingship as much as wealth. In October of 1216, John was traveling through eastern England. The exact sequence of events remains somewhat uncertain, but according to surviving accounts, part of his baggage train attempted to cross an area known as the Wash. The Wash is a large coastal inlet where tides can dramatically transform the landscape. At low tide, extensive areas of mud flats and sandbanks become exposed. At high tide, water rapidly returns. Even today, the region demands caution. In the medieval period, the risks were even greater. Crossing such terrain required local knowledge and careful timing. Somewhere during this journey, disaster struck. According to historical accounts, wagons, pack animals, supplies, and valuables became trapped by incoming tides. The result was chaos. Property was lost. Equipment disappeared. And among the missing items, according to later reports, were portions of the royal treasure. This is the moment at the heart of the mystery. What exactly was lost? Where did it go? And can it still be found? At first glance, the answer seems straightforward. The treasure was swallowed by the tides. End of story. Yet as historians began examining the evidence more carefully, complications emerged. One challenge involves the surviving sources themselves. The accounts describing the loss were written by medieval chroniclers. While these writers provide valuable information, they rarely offered the level of detail modern historians might wish for. Descriptions can be brief. Specific inventories are often absent. Terminology varies. As a result, determining precisely what disappeared is surprisingly difficult. Some sources suggest substantial losses, others are less specific. The phrase "crown jewels" itself can be somewhat misleading when applied to the medieval period. Modern readers often imagine a fixed collection of ceremonial regalia, preserved in a secure location. Medieval royal treasures functioned somewhat differently. Objects moved, collections changed. Items were gifted, exchanged, reused, or modified. The boundaries between personal wealth and royal regalia were not always clear. Consequently, when sources mention lost treasure, historians must carefully interpret what those descriptions actually mean. Even so, most scholars agree that significant valuables were probably involved. The loss appears to have been serious enough to attract contemporary attention, yet uncertainty surrounding the contents contributes directly to the mystery. After all, it is difficult to search for something when nobody knows exactly what was missing. The geography of the Wash creates another layer of complexity. Coastal environments change constantly. Channels shift, sediment accumulates. Storms reshape shorelines. Areas that were exposed land in one century may be underwater in another. Mudflats migrate, tidal patterns evolve. The longscape encountered by King John's baggage train in 1216 does not perfectly match the landscape visible today. This presents enormous challenges for anyone attempting to locate lost objects. Even if treasure was indeed lost in a specific location, that location may now be buried beneath layers of sediment. Alternatively, currents may have dispersed materials over wide areas. The passage of 8 centuries only increases the difficulty. Yet despite these obstacles, the mystery has inspired generations of treasure hunters. Over the centuries, numerous searches have been conducted. Some focused on historical documents, others examined particular areas of the Wash. Occasionally, discoveries generated excitement. Coins were found, artifacts emerged, speculation flourished, but none of these finds conclusively solved the mystery. No verified cache of King John's lost treasure has ever been recovered. This absence raises an interesting possibility. What if the traditional story is incomplete? Some historians have explored alternative interpretations. Perhaps the losses were smaller than later accounts suggested. Perhaps certain valuables survived. Perhaps chroniclers emphasized the event because it symbolized broader difficulties facing the king. Medieval writers often viewed history through moral and symbolic lenses. Disasters could acquire meanings beyond their immediate circumstances. A king experiencing political troubles, who then loses part of his treasure train, presents a compelling narrative. The story practically invites interpretation. This does not mean the loss was invented, only that historical events sometimes become more powerful in memory than they were in reality. Another fascinating question concerns whether the most valuable objects were actually present. Royal administrations typically took precautions regarding particularly important items. Some treasures may have traveled separately, others may have been stored elsewhere. Documentation is incomplete. As a result, historians continue debating how much of the royal regalia was truly involved. The uncertainty keeps the mystery alive. If a substantial portion of the crown jewels disappeared, the story becomes one of the greatest treasure losses in English history. If the losses were more limited, the event remains significant but somewhat less dramatic. The evidence supports neither conclusion completely. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the mystery is how it intersects with King John's final days. Only a short time after the incident, the king died. His health had already been deteriorating. The pressures of civil conflict weighed heavily upon him. The loss of supplies and equipment may have compounded existing difficulties. Whether directly or indirectly, the disaster occurred during the closing chapter of his reign. This timing contributed to the event's historical significance. A troubled king, a kingdom in crisis, a treasure lost to the sea. Then the ruler himself dies shortly afterward. The narrative possesses a dramatic quality that helped ensure its survival in historical memory. Over time, legends naturally accumulated around the story. Some imagined enormous fortunes resting beneath the mud. Others envisioned jeweled crowns lying untouched beneath layers of sediment. Popular accounts occasionally transformed uncertainty into certainty, describing the treasure in increasingly vivid terms. Yet historians remain more cautious. The available evidence supports the existence of a loss. Beyond that, many details remain unclear. This distinction is important. Historical mysteries often survive because certainty proves elusive. If the treasure had been recovered, the story would largely be over. If comprehensive records survived, many questions would be answered. Instead, gaps remain. And where gaps exist, curiosity flourishes. Modern technology occasionally revives interest in the mystery. Advances in surveying techniques, archaeological methods, and environmental analysis offer new opportunities to investigate historical landscapes. Researchers can study sediment patterns, reconstruct historical coastlines, analyze areas previously difficult to examine. Yet even these tools face limitations. The wash remains a challenging environment, and without precise information regarding the original location, the search resembles looking for a needle in a constantly changing haystack. Still, hope persists. After all, remarkable discoveries occur from time to time. Shipwrecks are found, lost artifacts emerge, forgotten sites are rediscovered. History occasionally returns what it once concealed. Whether that will ever happen in the case of King John's treasure remains unknown. As evening settles across the tidal flats of eastern England, the landscape continues its ancient rhythm. Water advances, water retreats, mudflats appear and disappear beneath changing tides. The environment that challenged medieval travelers remains powerful today. Somewhere beneath those shifting sediments, traces of the past may still rest. Or perhaps the treasure was scattered long ago beyond any possibility of recovery. No one can say with certainty, and that is precisely why the mystery endures. A royal treasure vanished during a moment of crisis. A kingdom stood on the edge of transformation. A king approached the end of his reign. 8 centuries later, historians still ask the same questions. What was truly lost? Where did it disappear? And could the lost crown jewels of King John still be waiting beneath the waters and mud of the Wash? For now, the tides keep their secret. The disappearance of the colony of New Potosi. Throughout history, certain places seem to exist on the boundary between fact and legend. They appear briefly in documents. A handful of references survive. Maps hint at their location. Travelers mention them in passing. Then, just as suddenly, they disappear. No ruins are identified. No complete records remain, and future generations are left wondering whether the place truly existed at all. The mystery of New Potosi belongs to this unusual category. Unlike a lost shipwreck or a missing treasure, the puzzle is not simply about where something went. The deeper question is whether historians fully understand what they are searching for in the first place. Was New Potosi a genuine colonial settlement that faded from history? A proposed community that never fully materialized? A misunderstanding repeated through documents and reports? Or perhaps a place that existed briefly before vanishing so completely that only scattered traces survived? The available evidence offers possibilities, but no definitive answers. And that uncertainty has transformed New Potosi into one of the more intriguing forgotten mysteries of the colonial world. To understand the story, we must first examine the significance of the name itself. Potosi was already one of the most famous locations in the early modern world. The original city of Potosi, located in present-day Bolivia, became renowned after enormous silver deposits were discovered in the nearby mountain known as Cerro Rico. By the 16th century, Potosi had become synonymous with wealth. Its silver helped shape global trade networks. Its reputation spread across continents. To merchants, explorers, investors, and governments, the name represented opportunity, extraordinary opportunity. As a result, references to places carrying similar names naturally attracted attention. A new Potosi implied potential riches, a new source of wealth, perhaps even another mining center capable of generating immense profits. Such associations were powerful, and they help explain why references to New Potosi captured interest whenever they appeared. The challenge begins with the documents themselves. Unlike major colonial settlements that generated extensive records, New Potosi appears only intermittently in surviving historical sources. Mentions are rare, descriptions are often brief, details frequently conflict. Researchers attempting to reconstruct the story encounter a frustrating pattern. A reference emerges. It suggests the existence of a place. Then the trail abruptly fades. Another source appears years later. Yet instead of clarifying matters, it often introduces additional uncertainty. The result resembles a puzzle assembled from only a fraction of its original pieces. One of the central difficulties involves location. Historical references associated with New Potosi do not always point clearly toward the same geographic area. Some descriptions appear connected to frontier regions where colonial expansion was ongoing. Others suggest locations associated with mining ambitions, exploration efforts, or settlement schemes. Because the surviving evidence is so fragmented, historians have struggled to determine whether all references concern a single place. It is possible that they do. It is also possible that different writers use the name in different contexts. This ambiguity lies at the heart of the mystery. Even before we ask what happened to New Potosi, we must first determine exactly what New Potosi was. The broader colonial world provides important context. The early modern era witnessed an extraordinary expansion of exploration and settlement across the Americas. Empires competed for territory. Investors funded ambitious ventures. Expeditions searched for resources. New communities appeared across vast distances. Some flourished, others failed. Many survived only briefly before being abandoned. In such an environment, proposed settlements often existed on paper before they existed in reality. Plans circulated, investments were discussed, locations were selected. Sometimes communities were established successfully, sometimes they never advanced beyond the planning stage. This reality creates another possibility. Perhaps New Potosi represented an aspiration more than a settlement, a project imagined by colonial authorities, investors, or explorers, a place discussed extensively but never fully realized. If so, the mystery becomes less about disappearance and more about historical misunderstanding, yet the evidence remains insufficient to settle the question conclusively. Another fascinating aspect involves the role of rumor in colonial expansion. Information traveled slowly across great distances, reports were copied repeatedly, letters passed through multiple hands. News often changed as it spread. A promising discovery might become exaggerated. A small mining operation could evolve into stories of extraordinary wealth. A temporary encampment might acquire the reputation of a permanent settlement. Such transformations occurred frequently. People wanted success stories. Investors wanted encouraging reports. Governments sought evidence that frontier ventures justified continued support. Under these conditions, information could become increasingly optimistic. The legend of New Potosi may have benefited from exactly this process. A modest reality might gradually have become something much larger in the historical imagination. Historians examining colonial records frequently encounter this phenomenon. Descriptions of frontier regions often contain mixtures of fact, hope, speculation, and misunderstanding. Separating these elements is one of the great challenges of historical research. New Potosi exemplifies this difficulty perfectly. The available evidence never becomes entirely reliable. Every source raises new questions. Every clue seems accompanied by uncertainty. Cartography provides another intriguing layer. Maps from the colonial era occasionally preserve names that later disappeared. Some settlements survived, others vanished. Some locations shifted, others turned out to be based on incomplete information. Mapmakers worked with whatever data they could obtain. Their products reflected contemporary understanding, not necessarily objective reality. Consequently, the appearance of a place on a map does not guarantee its long-term existence, nor does its absence prove it never existed. Researchers have carefully examined historical maps for references associated with New Potosi. These efforts have yielded interesting clues, yet they have not produced a definitive solution. Like the written records, the cartographic evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive. Archaeology might seem like an obvious path toward resolution. If New Potosi was a real settlement, surely physical remains should exist. In theory, yes. In practice, matters are more complicated. Colonial settlements varied enormously in size and durability. Some consisted of substantial buildings and permanent infrastructure. Others were little more than temporary camps. A community occupied briefly might leave surprisingly limited traces. Environmental conditions further complicate preservation. Vegetation can conceal ruins. Flooding can alter landscapes. Construction materials deteriorate. Over centuries, evidence may become difficult to recognize. Without a confirmed location, archaeological investigation becomes particularly challenging. Researchers cannot excavate everywhere. The search requires clues, and clues remain scarce. This uncertainty has encouraged a variety of interpretations. Some historians believe New Potosi probably existed in some form but failed to survive. Frontier settlements often faced immense obstacles: supply shortages, economic difficulties, disease, changing political priorities, competition from other communities. Many settlements disappeared after only a few years. If New Potosi followed this pattern, its disappearance would not be unusual. What would be unusual is the extent to which its memory faded. Other scholars emphasize the possibility that New Potosi became inflated through rumor and expectation. Perhaps a small operation generated outsized reports. Perhaps investors promoted optimistic narratives. Perhaps the name itself encouraged exaggeration. After all, associating any location with Potosi immediately evoked visions of wealth. People may have seen what they hoped to see. A third possibility occupies a middle ground. Perhaps New Potosi existed briefly and generated genuine excitement. Then changing circumstances led to abandonment. Over time, memories blurred, records were lost, stories evolved. The result became a hybrid of history and legend. This interpretation appeals to many researchers because it accommodates the fragmentary nature of the evidence. Yet, like every other theory, it remains difficult to prove. The mystery also highlights a broader truth about colonial history. Modern audiences often focus on successful settlements, the cities that grew, the colonies that endured, the regions that became important centers of population and commerce. But countless ventures failed. Ambitious plans collapsed. Communities disappeared. Entire projects vanished from memory. The historical landscape is filled with places that once seemed promising, but ultimately faded away. New Potosi may represent one of these forgotten experiments. If so, its disappearance tells us something important about the uncertainty of frontier life. Not every vision became reality. Not every dream survived. Perhaps that is why the mystery continues to resonate. At its core, the story concerns human ambition. People imagined opportunity, invested resources, crossed vast distances, pursued hopes of prosperity. Then, something happened. A plan changed. A settlement failed. A location was forgotten. Or perhaps the place never fully existed as later generations imagined. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. A name remains. The details do not. Historians continue searching because unanswered questions possess a remarkable power. Every fragment invites interpretation. Every document offers the possibility of revelation. A single overlooked reference could transform understanding. An archival discovery might clarify decades of uncertainty. History occasionally produces such surprises. Lost information reappears. Forgotten records emerge from collections. Questions once considered impossible suddenly become answerable. Could that happen with New Potosi? Perhaps. The possibility cannot be dismissed. Archives continue to yield discoveries. researchers continue examining neglected materials. New technologies allow documents to be studied in ways previous generations never imagined. The mystery remains open. As evening settles across the landscapes once associated with colonial expansion, it becomes easier to appreciate how fragile historical memory can be. Communities rise and fall. Names appear and disappear. Records survive unevenly. What seems important in one century may be forgotten the next, yet occasionally traces remain. A reference in a letter, a notation on a map, a brief mention in an official report, enough to suggest that something once existed, not enough to explain it fully. New Potosi occupies that uncertain territory, a place suspended between documentation and disappearance, a settlement that may have existed or may have been transformed by rumor, expectation, and imperfect memory. A mystery built not upon what historians know, but upon what they do not know. And perhaps that is what makes it so fascinating, because somewhere within the scattered records of the colonial world lies the truth, a truth obscured by time, fragmented by missing documents, and hidden behind centuries of uncertainty. For now, the story remains incomplete. The name survives, the place does not, and the mystery of New Potosi continues to linger at the edge of history, waiting for answers that may or may not ever come. The missing court records of the trial of Gilles de Rais. Some mysteries are hidden beneath oceans, others are buried beneath layers of earth. This mystery is hidden within missing pages, lost documents, absent testimony, and gaps in a historical record that should have been far more complete. At first glance, it may seem unusual to build a mystery around paperwork, yet historians often depend upon documents as much as archaeologists depend upon artifacts. A single manuscript can transform understanding of an entire era. A forgotten letter can solve a centuries-old question, and when important records disappear, uncertainty can endure for generations. The mystery of the missing court records connected to the trial of Gilles de Rais is one such case. It is not a mystery about whether a trial occurred. It certainly did. Nor is it a mystery about whether documents once existed. Many clearly did. Instead, the puzzle concerns what was lost, what survives, and how those absences continue to shape modern understanding of one of the most debated figures of 15th century France. More than 500 years later, historians still grapple with the consequences of those missing records. Because whenever evidence disappears, questions inevitably follow. And in this case, those questions are unusually difficult to answer. To understand the mystery, we must first understand the world in which it unfolded. The 15th century was a period of immense upheaval in France. The long conflict known as the 100 Years' War had transformed the political landscape. Kingdoms struggled for power. Armies crossed regions repeatedly. Economic disruption affected communities throughout the country. Amid this instability emerged a number of military leaders whose reputations became intertwined with the era's dramatic events. One of them was Gilles de Rais. Born into a wealthy noble family around the beginning of the 15th century, Gilles inherited substantial resources and extensive influence. He occupied a privileged position within French society. His family connections, wealth, and status opened opportunities unavailable to most people. As a young nobleman, he pursued a military career. And during a period of intense warfare, military success could bring both prestige and political importance. Historical sources indicate that Gilles participated in major campaigns associated with the latter stages of the 100 Years' War. Most notably, he became connected with the military efforts that included the famous figure Joan of Arc. Their association helped secure his place within historical memory. For a time, Gilles appeared to embody many of the qualities celebrated by medieval aristocratic culture: wealth, military achievement, influence, public recognition. Yet the story did not end there. In 1440, Gilles de Rais became the subject of legal proceedings that would permanently transform his reputation. Church authorities and secular officials conducted investigations. Witnesses testified. Charges were presented. Judgments were rendered. The trial became one of the most discussed legal cases of the late medieval period, and it is here that the mystery begins. Because despite the trial's significance, historians do not possess a complete record of everything that occurred. Some documents survive, others do not. and the missing material creates substantial challenges for researchers attempting to reconstruct events with precision. At first glance, this might seem surprising. After all, important legal proceedings often generate extensive documentation. Medieval courts produced records. Witness statements were recorded. Official decisions were preserved. Administrative paperwork accumulated rapidly. Indeed, portions of the Gilles de Rais proceedings survive today. Researchers have access to significant documentary material. Without those surviving records, we would know far less than we currently do. Yet surviving does not mean complete, and completeness matters enormously. Imagine attempting to understand a modern legal case while possessing only portions of the evidence. Certain testimonies are preserved, others are missing. Some procedural documents survive, others disappeared centuries ago. The resulting picture may still be informative, but it will inevitably contain uncertainties. This is precisely the challenge historians face. One of the most important questions concerns the scale of the missing material. How much documentation originally existed? How much has been lost? The answer is difficult to determine. Medieval archives rarely survived intact. Wars, fires, political upheavals, neglect, environmental conditions, and simple accidents destroyed countless records across Europe. The disappearance of documents was not unusual. What makes this case distinctive is the historical importance attached to the trial itself. Researchers naturally wish they possessed every available source. Instead, they must work with an incomplete archive. This incompleteness has influenced historical interpretation for centuries. Some scholars focus on the surviving evidence and emphasize its significance. Others draw attention to the limitations created by missing records. Both perspectives acknowledge the same fundamental reality. The archive contains gaps, and those gaps matter. Another complication involves the nature of medieval legal documentation. Records were not necessarily designed to satisfy modern historical standards. Their purpose was administrative. Officials documented information they considered relevant. Certain details were emphasized, others received less attention. Consequently, even complete archives can leave questions unanswered. When portions of the archive disappear entirely, the challenge becomes even greater. Historians must carefully evaluate what survives while remaining aware of what may be missing. This balancing act lies at the heart of responsible historical analysis. The mystery becomes especially intriguing when we consider how records survive in the first place. Many people assume important documents endure because they are important. In reality, survival often depends upon circumstance. A manuscript may survive because it happened to be stored in a secure location. Another may vanish because a roof leaked during a rainy season. Historical preservation is not always rational. Chance plays a larger role than we might expect. As a result, archives frequently resemble archaeological sites. Fragments survive, others disappear. Researchers must reconstruct larger stories from incomplete remains. The trial of Gilles de Rais illustrates this reality vividly. We possess enough documentation to know their proceedings occurred, enough to understand major elements of the case, enough to study contemporary responses, yet not enough to eliminate every uncertainty. And whenever uncertainty exists, debate follows. This has produced a fascinating historiographical legacy. Over the centuries, scholars have interpreted the surviving evidence in different ways. Some emphasize institutional procedures. Others focus on political context. Some examine legal practices. Others explore cultural attitudes and social conditions. The missing records influence all these discussions because they limit what can be known with certainty. Researchers are therefore required to distinguish carefully between evidence and interpretation. A surviving document can support a conclusion. A missing document cannot. Yet historians must still consider the possibility that lost materials once contained relevant information. This tension creates one of the central challenges of historical scholarship. Another aspect of the mystery concerns archival dependency. Historians sometimes know that documents existed because other documents refer to them. A record cites a previous record. A summary references a missing testimony. An inventory lists materials that no longer survive. Through these indirect clues, researchers can glimpse portions of an archive that have vanished. The surviving record becomes a shadow of something larger. The same phenomenon appears in studies of the Gilles de Rais trial. Certain references suggest the existence of materials now lost. Exactly what those materials contain remains uncertain, but their absence reminds us that modern understanding depends upon only part of the original documentary landscape. The broader context of 15th century France further complicates matters. This was not an era of centralized archival preservation comparable to modern institutions. Records were stored in various locations. Political circumstances changed frequently. Administrative systems evolved. Wars disrupted continuity. Even when documents survived initially, their long-term preservation was far from guaranteed. Over generations, losses accumulated, entire collections vanished. The disappearance of some trial records therefore fits broader historical patterns, yet recognizing this pattern does not make the mystery less significant. If anything, it highlights how much of the medieval past remains inaccessible. Perhaps the most fascinating question is whether the missing records would actually resolve modern debates. Many people assume that complete documentation automatically produces certainty. History rarely works that way. Even comprehensive archives require interpretation. Witnesses disagree. Officials possess biases. Context matters. Additional records might clarify some questions while raising entirely new ones. Nevertheless, most historians would welcome the opportunity to examine every surviving document associated with the trial. More evidence almost always improves understanding. The tragedy is that such evidence may no longer exist, or if it does, it remains undiscovered. That possibility continues to inspire occasional optimism. Archives occasionally yield remarkable surprises. Forgotten manuscripts emerge from collections. Misidentified documents are recognized. Materials believed lost reappear unexpectedly. Such discoveries are uncommon, but they happen. As long as archives remain unexamined and collections remain incomplete, the possibility of new evidence persists. Whether that possibility applies here remains impossible to know. Yet historians continue searching. Because history is full of unexpected recoveries. As we reflect on this mystery, it becomes clear that it differs from many others discussed throughout this journey. There is no hidden treasure waiting beneath a river, no lost city concealed within a forest, no vanished expedition drifting beyond the horizon. Instead, the mystery resides in absence itself. Missing pages, lost records, questions that survive because evidence does not, and perhaps that makes it especially powerful. History often feels solid, fixed, permanent. Yet much of what we know depends upon fragile materials that survived against extraordinary odds. Paper decays, ink fades, libraries disappear, archives fragment. The historical record is far less complete than we sometimes imagine. The missing court records associated with the trial of Gilles de Rais remind us of that reality. They illustrate how easily knowledge can be diminished, how uncertainty can persist, and how even major events can remain partially hidden behind the passage of time. As evening settles across the landscapes of Western France, centuries have passed since the trial took place. Castles have changed, governments have risen and fallen, generations have come and gone. Yet researchers still return to the surviving documents, searching for insight, reading familiar pages, examining overlooked details, wondering what might have been contained within the records that no longer exist. Perhaps those missing documents held important answers. Perhaps they merely repeated information already known. Perhaps they would have transformed historical understanding entirely. We cannot know, because the records themselves remain absent, and so the mystery endures. Not as a story of hidden gold or forgotten kingdoms, but as a reminder that history is often shaped as much by what has been lost as by what has survived. The pages are missing, the questions remain, and somewhere within the silence left behind by those vanished records lies a part of the past that may never be fully recovered. Outrow. And so our journey through 10 haunting mysteries comes to an end, from the uncertain fate of the Beothuk survivors to the hidden tomb of Alaric, from banished expeditions crossing the North Atlantic to forgotten settlements lingering on old maps, from missing archives in Greenland to unanswered questions surrounding kings, monks, colonies, treasures, and lost records. Each mystery reminds us of something important. History is not a complete story. It is a collection of surviving fragments. For every document preserved, countless others disappeared. For every site excavated, many remain undiscovered. For every question answered, new questions emerge. Perhaps that is why these mysteries continue to fascinate us, not because they promise certainty, but because they reveal the limits of certainty. They remind us that the past is not a finished puzzle. Some pieces remain missing, some may never be found, and yet the search continues. As historians, archaeologists, researchers, and curious minds continue exploring these questions, new discoveries will undoubtedly emerge. Some mysteries may eventually be solved. Others may remain unresolved forever, but all of them offer a glimpse into the complexity of human history. A history filled not only with answers, but with wonder. Thank you for joining this journey through the quieter corners of the past. And as the night grows deeper, perhaps one final thought is worth carrying with you. The greatest mysteries are not always the things we do not know. Sometimes they are the things we almost know. The stories that survive in fragments, the truths hidden just beyond our reach, waiting patiently in the silence of history.